Look at that thing. Could you ask for a nicer running, idling engine? Well, it wasn't like that a few minutes ago when it was just giving me fits out in the parking lot of a store down the street over here. Now, this is an extremely common problem that if you mess around with these old cars, carbureted cars, you will run across this. So listen, here's the thing. Wait, let me shut this off. Yeah, you could shut these old Chryslers off by unplugging the ballast resistor. So, like I said, this is a common problem that if you mess around with carbureted cars, you will come across this. Here's a fact of life, right? If you mess around with old vehicles, cars, motorcycles, trucks, tractors, doesn't make any difference. One of the realities is that you are always going to have to tinker. There's always going to be something, and you never know what it's going to be, okay? Now, if you're new to all of this, some of these very simple problems with old school fixes can be pretty perplexing, and you'll end up firing a parts cannon at them to try to fix them. If you've been around the block, when certain symptoms appear, you know what they are. And this is what happened to me. So let me tell you what happened, okay? So Scribbles has been sitting for a few days while I've been using other vehicles. And this morning, just 20 minutes ago, I wanted to use it to run down to the store. So I fired it up, and I had to crank it because, you know, today's gas isn't formulated to stay put, it evaporates. So when these cars sit for a couple of days, you've got to crank them to get the fuel to pump up. You can fix that by putting a small electric pump someplace in line so that you don't have to crank it. But for simplicity's sake, I don't bother with that. I just know what's going to happen, and I'm prepared to crank and pump until the gasoline comes up to the carburetor. All right, so I crank it. She fires up. It's on the choke, high idle. It sounds great, okay? No problems. I let it run for a few seconds, hit the gas, kicks down to the next high idle, and it's still idling okay, but not quite perfect. Not a big deal. So I pull out onto the road. I go, I don't know, a half mile down the road, 3/4 of a mile. I pull into the store, and when I take my foot off the gas, she just dies. Okay? All right. Pump it a couple of times, start it with my foot on the gas. She runs perfect. Take my foot off the gas, and it dies. Will not idle. Now, I automatically know what the problem is, and I already know what the fix is. So I implement it. It takes a minute, and I'm going to demonstrate this to you in a minute. But first, I have to explain the dynamic, what exactly happens here. Because like I said, this is a common thing. This is going to happen if you run around with a carbureted car, right? This is the stuff that gives carbureted cars a bad name, but only because people know what they're dealing with. You will come across this. So here's what you need to know about carbureted fuel systems. The fuel tank, as well as the carburetor itself, are vented to the atmosphere. And because they're vented to the atmosphere, they're subjected to moisture in the atmosphere. See, later, newer cars with sealed fuel systems, they're not, okay? It's a sealed fuel system. So let's say extremely humid days, you know, that sort of thing, won't affect the air that's in the system. But because these things are vented to the atmosphere, humid days, long humid periods, moisture collects inside the carburetor, collects inside the fuel tank. Now, these are normal situations. It's a normal occurrence. One of the things you need to know about fuel tanks, gasoline fuel tanks, carbureted car fuel tanks, is that they're all designed to have a certain amount of water at the bottom of them. Just like the big tanks at the filling stations, at gas stations, they're all designed to have like a foot of water at the bottom of them. So the pickup isn't at the bottom, right? The pickup is always raised above. And it's the same thing with the fuel pickups in a carbureted gas tank. They never touch the floor of the tank. There's always an inch or two of space between the strainer, the sock and the floor of the tank, because it's expected that a certain amount of water is going to gather in the tank. People who are just coming into this now, like, newcomers, they don't know this because it's not part of their normal, Now, in the old days, when carburetors and all of this was very common, we used to use a product called dry gas. And it's still out there. Dry gas goes under a couple of different names like heat, okay? So the purpose of dry gas, the sun is moving around. The purpose of dry gas is it's alcohol, it's methanol, right? And you pour it in the tank, and it bonds with the water that's in the tank and allows it to get sucked through the system and burned up. So when you had a problem where a car was constantly stalling, always giving you problems like that, fuel-related problems, you throw a couple of cans of dry gas in there, run it around for a couple of hours, and then everything is all smooth and stuff, because it bonds to the water in the bottom of the tank, and then that water, the water alcohol mixture, gets pumped through the system and it gets burned. So that's what dry gas did. All right, so boy, I'm getting really long-winded here because I want to talk about the specific problem. But you have to understand where this all comes from, right? How this happens. So what happened in my case just now this morning was that as the car sat, water, perhaps it was condensation inside the carburetor or some water from inside the tank, got pumped up into the carburetor. And once it got pumped into the carburetor, it can't get through the idle circuits, because the idle circuits are tiny, and the idle circuit is always segmented. So this car has a Carter BBD in it, very, very simple, rudimentary carburetor, but this is a system that's common to all carburetors, because all idle systems or all idle circuits are broken into two parts. You've got the part of the idle circuit that draws fuel, right? And it can come from several different places, but it's always going to be in the bowl, right? And then you've got the part of the idle circuit that actually feeds the engine. That's where your adjustment screws are. So in our case here, here's the bowl, and someplace in the bowl, and in this case it's through the main jets, there's a circuit that goes up here, okay, someplace in this range, like above the boosters, and then there's an air brake. And then from the air brake, it goes back down, and that's where these screws are, okay? That's where your idle screws are. So you've got two segments to every idle circuit. And again, it doesn't matter what kind of carburetor. They're all different in some way, but they all operate off the same basic principle. That's what you need to understand. So I'm showing this on a Carter BBD, but the same is true for a Holly, the same is true for an Edelbrock, any of these carburetors. So you've got a segmented idle circuit. Part one brings fuel from the bowl up to a level above the boosters, where there's like some sort of air brake, and then you've got the circuitry that goes back down to where the idle screws are. So what happened here, and what happens very often, very common, and I can see people like pulling their hair out and just ordering a new carburetor. What happens is water will get in that idle circuit. Now, the idle circuit is very, very small, and it's only intended to pull a fuel like gasoline or alcohol through it. But water doesn't want to get pulled through that way. Water is substantially heavier than those other two fuels, or the other two liquids. So what will happen is that water will enter into the idle circuitry someplace between the bowl and the air brake above, and it won't be able to pull it down into the circuit that you're adjusting, or to the base circuit. Now, if water does happen to get into that base circuit, it's taken care of just through the engine idling, because the throttle blades are closed and this section of the carburetor sees the highest vacuum. So it will pull any type of moisture or water through that lower part of the circuit. But what happens when the water gets into the upper part above the air brake? At that point, it won't idle. No matter what you do, it won't idle. It'll idle on the choke because the choke is pulling fuel through the boosters. It's pulling additional fuel through the boosters, but it's not pulling any fuel through the, or not pulling enough fuel through the idle circuit to actually run. So how do you fix this? This is so primitive and so old school. So it puts you down over here. All right. Plug this back in. So here's what you do with this, okay? It won't idle. It just, as soon as you take your hand off the gas or your foot off the gas, it dies. So here's what you do. It's best if you can figure out a way to start your car from under the hood. Some cars are very easy. Fords and Chryslers are very easy to start from under the hood. GM cars, not so much. You may need somebody to help you along with this. Sit in the car and crank it while you operate everything under the hood, all right? But in this case, we can just trip out our starter relay here and crank the motor. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start, this is gonna get loud, so I'm gonna have to yell, okay? All right, so pretend that this is not idling now. It won't idle. What you wanna do is you gotta give it gas, keep it alive, like that, right? Keep it alive, then rev the motor really hard. Let me do it again, okay? Rev the motor high, choke it, and take your hand off the choke. One more time. We're gonna rev the motor, and then choke it. And then right before it dies, take your hand off the choke. Okay, so what did that accomplish? How does that work? How does this fix anything? Well, when you close the choke, you rev the motor high, and then you close the choke, you're creating a huge amount of vacuum inside the carburetor under the choke plate. Now, normally that vacuum, if you just take your foot off the gas, that vacuum is all going to be located below the throttle blades. But because you're holding the throttle open at the same time that you're closing the choke, you're causing a huge amount of vacuum through the upper part of the circuitry, through the upper part of the idle circuitry. And what that will do is pull the water through. Okay, it'll suck the water through. It usually takes 2 or 3 times to actually make it, like I just did it 2 or 3 times there. That's usually what it takes to do it when you have this problem out on the road. And you know, the funny thing is, it's like, for me, it happened just now when I went to start it and drive it initially after it sat for a couple days. But this could really happen to you anytime, any place, where you're just driving along, you've pulled up to a stoplight, and the car just stalls, and then it won't stay running unless you give it a little bit of gas. 99% of the time, that's what happened. It sucked some water into that first part, the part of the idle circuitry that isn't exposed to manifold vacuum, and now it can't pull it through and let it idle. Almost too easy, right? But it works. It works. So here's what you need to know about this. If it happens once, consider it a fluke, put it out of your head, and just move on. But if it happens a couple of times in a short period of time, it means that you've got a significant amount of water someplace in the fuel system, probably in the bottom of the tank. And at that point, a couple of cans of dry gas in there, or heat, or whatever brand name they're using, a couple of cans of that will generally fix things. If it persists beyond that, it means you've got a huge amount of water in the tank, and that's not all that uncommon. It does happen. Drop the tank, drain it out, clean it out, put it back together again, you'll be okay. But that's how you fix that, especially out on the road, right? All right, now, I can't talk about carburetor and idling problems without going into one that will give you similar symptoms to that, but be a completely different thing. So the symptom is, as long as you're driving, as long as your foot's on the gas, it's okay. But now you come to a stop and it doesn't want to idle. or it's idling really, really rough. It's idling heavy, you get a gas smell, maybe some black smoke out of the exhaust, but it just doesn't want to idle, especially in gear. You've got to put it in neutral and you got to give it gas to clear it out, and then it'll idle okay for a second or two, and then it'll go back to that chugging and laboring. All right, so when you have that, what that means is that the needle and seat is not seating. Now, generally speaking, it doesn't necessarily mean that the needle and seat went bad. What it usually means is that you've sucked a very small piece of something, a foreign object, into the fuel system. It got past the filter, and I'm going to show you something really important to know in a minute. It got past the filter and it got wedged between the needle valve and the seat that it goes into. So on this carburetor here, we have an external needle and seat. This fuel line goes right into it, okay? So this is the seat, and this is a needle valve, right? And the tip of that valve is what blocks off the incoming fuel. So you've got the floats in here. As the bowl fills up with fuel, the floats rise. When they rise, they push forward on this needle into the seat, and that's what closes off the flow of fuel into the carburetor. Now, if you get the slightest, and I mean you can barely even see it, bit of debris between that seat, or the needle I should say, and the seat, it'll want to overflow the carburetor. So when it's a small amount of fuel, like in other words, like this isn't sealing completely, but it's letting a little bit of extra fuel seep through. What'll happen is the level in the bowls will come up higher than the booster, and it'll begin to drip gasoline down into the engine, and that's when she'll start running really rough and chugging and all the other stuff. So a minor bit of rust or rubber or any type of debris stuck there between the tip of the needle and the seat will give you that circumstance. You give it gas, it'll clear out. You take your hand off the gas, or you take your foot off the gas, it'll idle, and then it'll go. Well, that's probably what's happening. In a worst case scenario, it'll actually flood over the top of the carburetor. So if there's a substantial bit of debris between the needle and the seat, and it's allowing a lot of fuel through, well then you'll get a fountain out of this thing. In that case, you've probably got to dig into the carburetor and either replace the needle and seat or find what more. Now these do go bad. They do go bad. But more often than going bad, they'll actually be subjected to a bit of debris in there. And I mean just the tiniest bit of debris. So let's just say, for example, now you're out on the road and you pull into a parking lot, or you come to a stop, and it's doing that, and it's not flooding really fuel over the top, but it's not idling, and it won't idle. How do you fix that? This is my favorite thing in the world. How do you fix that? You take an implement, and in my preferred implement when doing this is an adjustable wrench. These things are just perfect for the job. Okay, just the right amount of weight, small area right here so you can pinpoint your hits, and all you want to do is tap the carburetor, tap the needle and seat, tap the carburetor like that. Not very forceful, don't be jamming on it, okay? All you want to do is create a shock. That's it, just like that. And if there is a tiny bit of debris, between the needle and the seat, that'll dislodge it. Motor on like nothing ever happened, okay? Now, if it happens repeatedly, over and over again, it means that the needle and seat assembly is probably worn. Now, in the case of this BBD here, you don't have to take the carburetor apart, you don't have to do anything. You just you unscrew it and you screw a new one in externally. But most carburetors, it's internal. Like Holley's are external, well, most Holleys are external. Quadrajets and Carters, Edelbrocks, those are all internal. So you've got to actually go into the carburetor to replace those. But if it happens just once, it's probably just a little bit of debris. It's a fluke. Tap it, it'll dislodge it, and then you could just motor around and forget about it. Now here's an important tip. Generally speaking, that debris is not going to get through a filter. When you get that debris, it'll come, generally speaking now, from rubber fuel lines disintegrating, okay, a little bit at a time. So you'll get little flecks of rubber come off of the line. So here's what you want to do with this. You want to make sure that between your filter and the hard line of the carburetor is as short a section of rubber as possible. And you want to make sure that when I say as short a section as possible, you want to have the metal from or the tip of the filter, or this is a metal one, but if it's a plastic filter, you want to have the tip of the plastic basically touching the tip of the metal. And you're only using this section of rubber here as a coupler. Because generally speaking, the rubber that comes from a deteriorating fuel line, like right here, is what's going to get in there. So to eliminate that, you want to have the filter as close to the carburetor as possible, and you want to have as little rubber connection as possible, and you only want the rubber connection to be an outer sleeve. You want the metal line and the nipple from the fuel filter to be just about touching each other, if at all possible. And that'll almost completely eliminate the possibility of debris getting into the needle and seat. I see a lot of guys, they'll run rubber line directly from the carburetor, like 3 feet of it before they get to a filter of any sort. But this is how you want to have it set up. You want the filter and the metal line and like as little rubber exposure as possible. Rubber on the other side of the filter, it's not a big deal because the filter will catch that rubber. So keep that in mind. All right, very simple, primitive fixes, right? You choke it or whack it and you can get this thing running again. That's the beauty of carbureted cars. All right, I hope you got something out of that. And be prepared to tinker. Don't get frustrated. It's part of it. It's all part of it. And it's the learning and the experience and the overcoming those little obstacles. You know, it makes you a champion. Every day you do this, you're a champion. You beat it with an adjustable wrench. I'll see you tomorrow.